Sometimes the things we're running from follow us into the quietest places. Sometimes the secrets we keep become the very prisons we live in. 62-year-old Greer Talbot had spent decades in the Appalachian wilderness, seeking solitude among abandoned cabins and forgotten trails. She thought she knew every corner of these mountains. But on a cold October morning, she pushed open the door of a cabin that looked like all the others and found 12 elderly men staring back at her. They called themselves the Still 12. They hadn't left these woods in over 30 years. What were they hiding from that kept them locked away from the world for so long? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Greer Talbot had learned long ago that the mountains didn't judge. They simply existed, ancient and patient, offering shelter to anyone willing to accept their terms. For 15 years, she'd lived by those terms, waking with the sun, tracking deer paths through laurel thickets, marking the slow transformation of seasons in the color of leaves and the temperature of morning air. The Appalachian wilderness had become more than her home. It had become her refuge from a life that had once felt too loud, too demanding, too full of expectations she could never quite meet. She hadn't always been this way. Once she'd been a wife, a mother, a park ranger with a steady paycheck and a house that smelled like Sunday dinners. Once she'd known the rhythm of family life, school pickups, birthday parties, the comfortable weight of her husband's arm around her shoulders as they watched television on quiet evenings. But James had died suddenly, a heart attack at 51 while raking leaves in their yard, and something in Greer had died with him. Not her love for her daughter, Sophie, not her ability to function, just her willingness to pretend that life made sense anymore. Sophie had been 23 when James passed, old enough to grieve independently, young enough to need her mother desperately. Greer had tried, God knows she'd tried, but every casserole dish from concerned neighbors, every well-meaning piece of advice, every expectation that she would simply continue living as if half her heart hadn't been buried in Mountain View Cemetery. It had all felt like weights tied to her ankles while she was trying to tread water. So she'd stopped trying to tread. She'd let herself sink, or maybe she'd swum towards something else. She still wasn't sure which. The arguments with Sophie had started small, Greer missing a lunch date, forgetting to return calls, spending more and more time in the mountains, taking solo trips that stretched from weekends to weeks. Sophie had accused her of running away. Greer had accused Sophie of not understanding grief. They'd both been right. The final conversation had been 3 years ago, bitter and brief. Sophie had said she couldn't watch her mother disappear anymore. Greer had said she was already gone. They hadn't spoken since, though Sophie sent a letter twice a year, Christmas and Greer's birthday. Greer read them, but never responded. What could she say that would matter now? Her cabin sat on the eastern slope of Blackburn Ridge, a simple structure she'd built herself over 2 long summers. 1 room, a loft for sleeping, a wood stove that kept her warm through winter. Solar panels on the roof, a creek nearby for water. She kept a vegetable garden in season, hunted when she needed to, and made occasional trips to the town of Kenton, population 800, for supplies she couldn't produce herself. The townspeople knew her as the quiet woman who lived in the woods, polite but distant. They'd stopped trying to make small talk years ago. Her days followed a pattern that brought her peace. Morning coffee on the porch, watching fog lift from the valleys. A few hours of work, splitting wood, mending fences, tending the garden. Afternoons for hiking, exploring, documenting. She kept detailed journals of the old homesteads scattered throughout these mountains, sketching their remains, photographing what was left, imagining the lives that had unfolded within those weathered walls. It was history work in a way, preservation through observation. She told herself it mattered. The brass compass she carried everywhere had been her father's, given to her the Christmas before he died. They hadn't been close. He'd been stern, emotionally distant, a man who believed feelings were weaknesses to be overcome. But on his deathbed, he'd pressed the compass into her palm and said, "Don't get lost, Greerly." her childhood nickname, unused for decades. She'd cried then, grieving not just his death, but all the conversations they'd never had, all the warmth that had lived somewhere beneath his tough exterior but never quite reached the surface. She carried the compass, not because it helped her navigate. She knew these mountains better than any map, but because it reminded her that even difficult people carried love in ways they couldn't always. Expressed October had arrived with its usual fanfare. The maples blazed red and orange against the evergreens. The air turned crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth. Greer loved this season most, the sense of transition, of nature preparing for rest. She'd been documenting a cluster of abandoned homesteads near Copper Creek, sites she'd visited before, but wanted to photograph in autumn light. Her pack held her camera, notebook, water, and emergency supplies. She moved through the forest with the easy confidence of someone who'd walked these trails hundreds of times. The path to Copper Creek wound through dense rhododendron thickets and stands of hemlock so old they created a cathedral-like hush. Greer paused occasionally to mark her map, noting landmarks. A lightning-struck oak, a stone foundation barely visible beneath ivy, a spring that bubbled up through mossy rocks. She was thorough in her documentation, treating each discovery as if it might be the last remnant of someone's entire existence. In a way, it was. She'd been walking for 3 hours when she noticed something off. A trail she didn't recognize, narrow and overgrown but recently used. Boot prints in the mud, too fresh to be old. Branches broken at chest height, suggesting someone had pushed through deliberately. Her instinct told her to mark it and move on. People sometimes hiked these mountains, hunters, adventurers, the occasional lost soul. But something about the trail's trajectory interested her. It headed toward a hollow she'd never fully explored, a deep crease in the mountain that her topographic map showed as steep and difficult terrain. Curiosity won out. She followed the trail, moving carefully, aware that her presence might not be welcome. The path descended sharply, switchbacking down a rocky slope thick with mountain laurel. The temperature dropped as she went deeper, the sun's warmth blocked by the dense canopy overhead. She could hear water running somewhere below, probably a creek feeding into Copper Creek's main channel. After 40 minutes of careful descent, she saw the cabin. It sat in a small clearing beside a creek, surrounded by mature hardwoods that had been there long before any structure. The cabin itself looked old but maintained. Logs still tight, roof intact, a stone chimney releasing a thin curl of smoke into the cool air. Greer stopped, suddenly aware that she was trespassing. This wasn't an abandoned homestead. Someone lived here. She should have turned back. Every instinct of privacy and respect said to leave. But something held her there, studying the scene. The cabin was too remote, too hidden. The trail leading to it was deliberately obscured. And there was something else, something she couldn't quite name, a quality of secrecy, of intentional isolation that went beyond simply wanting to live off-grid. Above the door hung a wooden sign, hand-carved and weathered but still legible, the Still 12. 12. Not a family name. Not a typical cabin designation, a number. A collective. Greer's heart beat faster. She told herself to leave, to respect whatever was happening here. But her feet carried her forward, drawn by a curiosity that felt almost separate from her conscious will. She approached the cabin slowly, listening. Voices inside, low and indistinct. The murmur of men talking. She counted at least 3 different speakers, maybe more. She stopped 10 feet from the door, suddenly unsure. What was she doing? She lived alone by choice, valued her privacy absolutely. Why would she violate someone else's? But the question that had formed in her mind wouldn't let go. What were 12 people doing, living in total isolation in one of the most remote parts of the Appalachian wilderness? Before she could decide, the door opened. A man stood in the doorway, elderly and weathered, with a grey beard and eyes that held both surprise and something like fear. He stared at her. She stared back. "You're lost," he said finally. Not a question, a statement, almost a plea. An invitation to agree, to turn around and pretend she'd never been here. "No," Greer said quietly. "I'm not lost." Behind him she could see into the cabin. More men, all elderly, all turning to look at her with expressions that ranged from shock to alarm. She counted quickly. 8 visible, maybe more out of sight. The man in the doorway, she'd later learn his name was Polk, seemed to age another 10 years in that moment. His shoulders sagged slightly, and he gripped the doorframe as if needing support. "Please," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Please just forget you saw us." But Greer knew even then that forgetting was impossible. She'd spent 15 years hiding from her own life, and she recognized the look in these men's eyes. They weren't just living off-grid, they were hiding. And unlike her quiet solitude, chosen and reversible, their hiding had the weight of permanence, of decades, of secrets that had calcified into a way of life. "How long have you been here?" she asked. Polk closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, they glistened with unshed tears. 30 years, he whispered. "We've been here 30 years." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. 30 years. These men, now in their 70s and 80s, had spent 3 decades in this hidden cabin, cut off from the world. Whatever had driven them here, whatever they were hiding from, it had been powerful enough to make them sacrifice everything familiar for this existence. Greer felt the compass weight in her pocket, her father's last gift. Don't get lost, Greerly. But standing there, looking at 12 men who had been lost or hidden for longer than many marriages lasted, she wondered if maybe being found was sometimes more terrifying than any wilderness. "My name is Greer Talbot," she said gently. "I live on Blackburn Ridge. I document old homesteads." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just trying to understand." Polk studied her for a long moment, and she could see him making calculations, weighing risks, deciding whether this unexpected encounter was a threat or something else. Finally, he stepped back slightly. "My name is Polk Harrison," he said. "And if you're going to stand there asking questions, you might as well come inside where it's warm." It wasn't exactly an invitation. It was more like an acknowledgement of inevitability, the way a dam accepts the first crack that will eventually bring it down. Greer stepped forward, crossing the threshold into a world that had existed, secret and separate, while she'd been building her own isolated life just a few ridges away. Inside, 11 other men watched her enter. The cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, a single great room with a loft above. Bunks lined 2 walls, a long table dominated the center, and the stone fireplace provided both heat and a cooking surface. It was clean, organized, almost military in its efficiency. These men had been here long enough to create a complete life, a functioning society of 12. She would learn their names eventually. She would learn their story. But in that first moment, all she felt was a strange kinship with these elderly men who had chosen isolation over whatever had waited for them in the world outside. She understood the impulse. She'd been living her own version of it for 15 years. The difference, she would come to realize, was that her isolation had been a choice she could unmake. Theirs had become a prison they couldn't escape, even if they wanted to. And whether they wanted to, whether they could even imagine wanting to after 30 years, was a question that would reshape all of their lives in ways none of them could yet. For see, the silence inside the cabin felt alive, breathing with the weight of 12 men's collective anxiety. Greer stood just inside the doorway, aware that her presence had shattered something fragile, a 30-year equilibrium built on secrecy and mutual isolation. The men arranged themselves around the long wooden table, some sitting, others standing against the walls, all watching her with expressions that ranged from hostile suspicion to something that looked almost like hope. Polk gestured to a chair near the fire. "Sit, coffee?" It wasn't hospitality so much as ritual, the automatic courtesy of men raised in a generation that offered refreshment even to unwelcome guests. Greer accepted, sensing that refusing would be interpreted as judgment. A younger man, though he had to be in his late 60s, poured dark coffee from a pot that had been sitting on the wood stove. He handed it to her without making eye contact. "I'm not here to cause problems," Greer said again, addressing the room. "I document old structures. That's all I do out here. This isn't an old structure," a thin man with white hair said sharply. "This is our home, and it's private. "I can see that," Greer replied evenly. "I apologize for intruding, but your sign, the Still 12, it raises questions. Questions we're not answering," the thin man said. Polk raised a hand, silencing him. "This is Harlan," he said, indicating the thin man. Then, gesturing around the room, he introduced the others: Boone, Vernon, Garrett, Lyle, Thatcher, Moss, Eugene, Randall, Sullivan, and Willis. 12 names for 12 men, though Greer noticed several seemed particularly frail, moving slowly, breathing heavily. These weren't young men playing at wilderness living. These were elderly survivors of something. Why the Still 12? Greer asked carefully. Why that name? Polk settled into a chair across from her, his weathered hands wrapped around his own coffee mug. He was perhaps 78, his beard more grey than white, his eyes a faded blue that had seen too much. "Because we made a promise," he said simply. 12 of us. We'd stay together, stay silent, stay still. Not moving, not speaking, not breaking faith with each other. For 30 years, for as long as necessary. Greer sipped her coffee, giving herself time to think. The brew was strong and bitter, made without any concession to pleasure, purely functional. Everything in this cabin seemed functional. No decorations, no personal items visible, nothing that suggested these men had individual lives beyond the collective. It reminded her of old photographs she'd seen of frontier communities, everyone's resources pooled for survival. "What are you hiding from?" she asked. The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of tension through the group. Several men shifted uncomfortably. Harlan made a sound of disgust, but Polk just looked at her steadily, weighing something she couldn't identify. "From the consequences of telling the truth," he said finally. "From people who wanted us silent. From a world that chose corporate profit over human lives." The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. Greer felt it physically, a tightening in her chest. This wasn't paranoia or delusion. This was old pain, calcified into permanent injury. "You were miners," she said, intuition forming the words before her conscious mind caught up. The age range, the camaraderie, the military-style organization, it fit a certain pattern. Something happened. An accident. Vernon, a man with kind eyes and stooped shoulders, nodded slowly. "Cedar Hollow Mine, West Virginia. April 1994. Worst disaster in the state's modern history." The name stirred vague memory. Greer had been in her 30s then, busy with her own young family, but she remembered news coverage of a mining disaster, bodies recovered, investigations launched. "How many died?" 17 good men, Boone said, his voice rough. He was probably the oldest, somewhere in his early 80s, with gnarled hands that suggested a lifetime of hard labor. 17 men with wives and children who died because the company ignored every safety warning we'd given them for 2 years. We survived. We testified. We thought that mattered. It didn't? Greer asked, though she already knew the answer. "It mattered enough to make us targets," Polk said. "The company offered settlements. Big money, with one condition: non-disclosure agreements. We sign, we take the cash. We never speak publicly about what we knew, about the ignored inspections, the falsified reports, the maintenance that was deferred to save costs, about the fact that those 17 men died because executives wanted better quarterly earnings." Greer felt cold despite the warmth of the fire. She'd heard similar stories before, seen the pattern of corporate malfeasance and the machinery that protected it. Most people would have signed. 11 of us refused, Harlan said. "We had families who needed the money, mortgages and medical bills and kids in school. But we'd watched our friends die in that hole. We'd carried bodies out. We couldn't put a price on keeping quiet about murder." 12 of you, Greer corrected, confused. "You said 12. The silence that followed was different from before. This one carried grief, sharp and fresh, despite 3 decades of distance." Polk looked down at his hands, and she saw his fingers tighten on the mug until his knuckles went white. Marcus Brennan signed. Vernon said quietly, "He was our friend, part of our crew. But he had a daughter with medical problems, bills that were drowning him. The company offered him $200,000. He took it." Vernon paused, swallowing hard. "We didn't blame him. We understood. But after he signed, after he took the money, things changed. The harassment started, Polk continued. Threatening calls at night. Cars following us. Break-ins where nothing was stolen, but everything was moved. Just enough to let us know someone had been there. 2 of the guys lost their jobs, both fired for pretend reasons, but everyone knew why. Lyle's house was vandalized 3 times in 2 months. My wife, he stopped, working his jaw. My wife started having panic attacks every time the phone rang. You went to the police. We went to everyone, Thatcher said. He was younger than most, probably only in late 60s, with the compact build of a man who'd stayed fit. Police, FBI, local news. We had no proof the company was behind it, and they had lawyers who made us look like paranoid conspiracy theorists. The official investigation cleared them of any wrongdoing. The settlement money was characterized as compassionate corporate responsibility, not hush money. Then Marcus died, Polk said flatly. Greer felt her stomach drop. How? Car accident. 6 months after he signed the agreement. Single vehicle, wet road, car went off an embankment. Official report said he'd been drinking. Polk's voice was hollow. Marcus didn't drink. Hadn't touched alcohol since his daughter was born. But they found an open bottle in the car, and his blood alcohol was above the legal limit. The implication hung heavy in the air. Greer wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but she'd lived long enough to know that powerful institutions protected themselves in ugly ways. You think he was murdered? We know he was silenced, Harlan said. Same result. After that we understood, Vernon added. The message was clear. Sign and stay quiet, or refuse and face consequences. Marcus signed and still died, probably because they worried he'd eventually talk. If they'd do that to someone who cooperated, what would they do to those of us who were actively defying them? So you disappeared, Greer said. We made a choice, Polk corrected. 12 of us. The 11 who refused to sign, plus 1 more who'd been too injured in the collapse to work the day of the settlement offer. We talked it through. All of us together, families included. We could stay and live in fear, watching over our shoulders, maybe ending up like Marcus. Or we could remove ourselves as threats, disappear so completely that we were no longer worth pursuing. Your families agreed to this? The pain that crossed their faces answered before their words did. Our families suffered no matter what, Boone said. At least if we left, the harassment would stop. And it did. Within 6 months of us vanishing, our families reported that the threatening calls stopped. The surveillance ended. We'd become ghosts, not worth the trouble anymore. Greer tried to imagine it. 12 men coordinating a simultaneous disappearance, saying goodbye to wives and children, walking away from every familiar thing. The logistics alone would have been staggering. How did you manage it? Carefully, Polk said. We planned for 8 months. Saved money and cash, gathered supplies, scouted locations. We left on the same night from different places, all heading here. We'd found this hollow during a hunting trip years before. Remote, water source, hidden. We built this cabin over the first 2 years, living in tents while we worked. And we made a pact. We'd stay together, protect each other, and never break silence about what we knew, unless all 12 agreed. The still 12. Not moving, not speaking, not breaking faith for 30 years, Greer repeated, the enormity of it settling on her. You've been here for 30 years. 30 years this past April, Vernon confirmed. I had a daughter who was 12 when I left. She's 42 now. I've missed her entire adult life. His voice cracked slightly. Missed her graduation, her wedding, the birth of her children. All of it gone. The rawness of his emotion made Greer's throat tight. She thought of Sophie, of their 3-year estrangement, and felt ashamed. 3 years had felt impossibly long. These men had lost decades. Do they know you're alive? She asked. Your families? They knew the first 10 years, Polk said. We sent letters through a contact, careful and infrequent. Enough to let them know we were safe, but not enough to create a trail. Then our contact died, and we lost that connection. We don't know what they know now. Whether they still think we're alive, or whether they've moved on, made their peace with us being gone. Greer looked around the cabin again, seeing it differently now. Not just a hidden shelter, but a self-imposed prison. a place where 12 men had locked themselves away from life itself. The bunks lining the walls, the communal table, the rigid organization. It all spoke of survival but not living. Just existence day after day, year after year, while the world outside moved on without them. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "You could have refused to answer, asked me to leave." Polk met her eyes, and she saw something shift in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. "Because you're the first person in 30 years who's found us. And because something in the way you looked at this place told me you understand isolation. You're not a threat. You're something else. I'm just not sure what yet." Greer didn't have an answer for that. She sat in the warmth of the cabin, drinking bitter coffee, surrounded by 12 elderly men who had sacrificed everything for a principle, for each other, for a truth that had cost them their lives even though they were still breathing. And she knew, with the certainty that comes from recognizing yourself in others, that she couldn't simply walk away. These men had found her as much as she'd found them. Whatever happened next, whatever they decided about her presence, something had changed for all of them. The secret had been witnessed. The still 12 were no longer invisible. And that meant everything. Their past, their present, their future was suddenly terrifyingly uncertain. Greer didn't return to the cabin for 3 days. She needed time to process what she'd learned, to sit with the weight of 12 men's collective sacrifice and decide what, if anything, she should do about it. She went through her normal routines, splitting wood, checking her rain barrels, tending the last of her autumn garden, but her mind kept circling back to that hidden hollow, to Polk's weary eyes and Vernon's broken voice describing a daughter he hadn't seen in 30 years. On the 4th day, she packed supplies. Dried venison, fresh bread she'd baked that morning, coffee, batteries, basic medical supplies. She told herself she was simply being neighborly, the way mountain people had always looked after each other. But deeper down, she knew it was more than that. Those men had trusted her with their story. That trust created obligation. The descent into the hollow felt different this time. She knew what waited at the end of the trail, knew the secret she was keeping simply by not reporting it. Though reporting what, exactly? 12 elderly men choosing to live off-grid wasn't illegal. They weren't fugitives. They were just men who'd opted out of a world that had failed to protect them. Polk was outside when she arrived, splitting wood with the methodical rhythm of someone who'd performed the task thousands of times. He saw her approach and stopped, leaning on the axe handle, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Wasn't sure you'd come back," he said. "I brought supplies." She set down her pack. "Thought you might need them. We manage." But his eyes lingered on the pack, and she could see the calculation happening, pride versus practical need. "Though we appreciate it. Come inside. Coffee's on." The cabin felt less tense this time, though several of the men still watched her warily. Harlan offered a grudging nod. Vernon smiled, a small expression that carried enormous warmth. Boone was working at the table, his gnarled hands shaping what looked like a wooden bowl, with surprising grace. "You're a craftsman," Greer observed, settling into a chair. Boone shrugged. "Something to do with the time. We've got plenty of that." He ran his thumb along the bowl's rim, checking for smoothness. "Made 63 of these over the years. Plates, cups, bowls, spoons. Started because we needed them. Kept doing it because it keeps the hands busy and the mind quiet." Greer understood that impulse. Her own cabin was filled with unnecessary projects completed simply to fill the hours. Elaborate wood carvings, dried flower arrangements, meticulously labeled jars of preserved vegetables. Idle hands invited reflection, and reflection could be dangerous when you were running from something. Over the next hour, the men gradually relaxed around her. They showed her their systems, the spring that provided water, the root cellar where they stored preserved food, the smoking shed for meat. Everything was organized with military precision, each man responsible for specific tasks. Polk handled planning and mediation. Harlan managed the hunting and trapping. Boone did carpentry and repairs. Vernon kept their ledger, a handmade book where he recorded everything. Weather patterns, supplies used, game harvested, firewood split. 3 decades of data in neat columns. "May I see it?" Greer asked, gesturing to the ledger. Vernon hesitated, then handed it over. The pages were filled with his careful handwriting, organized by month and year. She flipped back, reading entries from 1994. April 28th, arrived. Zetkamp, rain, then May. Frame started. Moss caught 2 rabbits. Garrett's cough better. Years compressed into brief notations, a life reduced to survival logistics. But in the margins, she found something else. Small sketches, a bird on a branch, a flower, a child's face. Vernon's daughter, she realized, drawn from memory. The sketches appeared throughout the ledger, little windows into grief that couldn't be expressed in the columns of data. She had your eyes, Greer said softly, tracing one of the drawings. Vernon's face tightened. She had her mother's smile. I always loved that about her. Even when she was angry, the smile would break through. He paused. I wonder if she still smiles that way. The question hung between them, unanswerable. Greer handed back the ledger, struck by the discipline these men had maintained. They'd created structure to survive, routine to replace the lives they'd left behind. But no amount of organization could fill the spaces where their families should have been. Do you ever regret it? She asked. The choice to come here. Every day, Polk said from across the room. He'd been listening, his coffee growing cold in his hands. But regret doesn't mean it was wrong. It just means it cost something. Everything that matters costs something. Over the following weeks, Greer fell into a pattern of visits. She came every 5 or 6 days, bringing supplies and news from the outside world. The men were hungry for information. What had changed in 30 years? What had stayed the same? She told them about the internet, smartphones, how communication had transformed. She described political shifts, social changes, the ways the world had evolved while they'd stayed still. Some of it delighted them. Sullivan, who'd always loved astronomy, was fascinated by the Mars rovers and the discovery of exoplanets. Thatcher wanted to know about advances in medicine. Had they cured cancer yet? Could they fix damaged hearts? Others seemed overwhelmed, as if 3 decades of change was too much to absorb all at once. Greer began to understand their individual personalities. Holland's gruffness masked deep sensitivity. He was the first to notice when someone was struggling, quick to offer help even while pretending not to care. Moss barely spoke, but communicated through actions, always ensuring everyone had enough food, enough warmth, enough space. Eugene and Randall were brothers, constantly bickering but completely devoted to each other. Willis had been a teacher before the mines, and he'd maintained that role here, teaching the others skills they needed. How to preserve food, treat injuries, build structures that would last. They also began to share their stories with her, fragments at first, then fuller accounts. Lyle described his wedding day, the way his bride had looked in afternoon sunlight filtering through church windows. Garrett talked about his son's first home run in Little League, how the kid had been so excited he'd forgotten to run the bases. Vernon showed her more drawings from his ledger. His daughter, at every age he'd known her, frozen in time at 12 years old in the final sketch. I don't know what she looks like now, he admitted. I try to imagine her grown, but I can't see it. In my mind, she's still 12, still my little girl. Greer found herself sharing too, cautiously at first, then more openly. She told them about James's death, about the weight of grief that had reshaped her entire life. About Sophie, about their estrangement, about the letters she received but never answered. Why don't you write back? Vernon asked, and there was no judgment in the question, only genuine curiosity. Because I don't know what to say, Greer admitted. I'm not the mother she deserves. I'm someone who ran away and built a life around absence. What could I possibly offer her now? The truth, Polk said simply. That's all anyone really wants. Not perfection. Just honesty about who we are and why we made the choices we made. But Greer noticed he said this without irony, even though he and the other men had spent 30 years avoiding exactly that kind of honesty with their own families. They'd chosen silence over truth, absence over difficult conversations. Who were any of them to talk about what people really wanted? Still, something was shifting. Greer felt it in the way the men talked about their past. A wistfulness that hadn't been there initially. Vernon touching his wedding ring, a simple silver band he'd never removed, with an expression of longing. Harlan asking specific questions about how to use the internet, whether someone could find people from 30 years ago. Thatcher wondering aloud if his children would even recognize him, whether they'd want to. The still 12, Greer was beginning to realize, weren't quite as still as they'd once been. The discipline that had sustained them was developing cracks, small fissures where doubt and hope leaked through. And she, by simply being there, by listening and asking questions, was widening those cracks whether she intended to or not. One evening, as she prepared to hike back to her own cabin, Polk walked her to the edge of the clearing. The autumn sun slanted through the trees, painting everything gold. "You've given us something dangerous," he said. "What's that?" "The possibility of a different ending." He looked back at the cabin, at the smoke rising from the chimney. "We built a life here based on acceptance. We'd given up certain things, made peace with never getting them back. But you show up, and suddenly we're remembering what we gave up, wondering if it's too late. That kind of wondering can destroy a man, or it can save him. I'm not sure which it'll be for us." Greer didn't have an answer. She touched the compass in her pocket, her father's gift, and thought about being lost versus being found. "Sometimes they were the same thing. I'll see you next week," she said. Polk nodded, but his expression carried weight, as if he knew that every visit brought them closer to a reckoning none of them were ready for. The still 12 had survived 30 years by staying exactly as they were. Change, after that long, might be the most dangerous thing of all. The letter from Sophie arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded from the post office box Greer maintained in Kenton. She recognized the handwriting before she even opened it. Her daughter's neat, precise script, so much like James's had been. This letter was different from the usual birthday and Christmas notes. It was longer, heavier. Greer sat on her porch with coffee growing cold beside her and made herself read it. "Mom," Sophie had written, "I know you probably won't respond to this, just like you haven't responded to any of my other letters. But I need to try one more time. Dad died 15 years ago. I miss him every day. But I lost you too, and you're still alive. That's harder somehow, knowing you're out there, choosing not to be part of my life. I'm getting married next spring. Michael is kind and patient, and he makes me laugh. I'd like you to be there. I'd like you to meet him. I'd like to have a mother again, even if we have to figure out what that means from scratch. I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I'm just asking you to try, please." Greer read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. She didn't cry. She'd learned years ago how to keep tears at bay, how to convert grief into something harder and less vulnerable. But her hands shook as she poured fresh coffee, and she couldn't quite catch her breath. Sophie was getting married. Her daughter, her baby, was building a life that Greer knew nothing about. And she'd been invited to witness it, to be part of it, if she could just find the courage to say yes. She thought about Vernon's drawings, his daughter frozen at 12 years old, about Polk's observation that they'd given up certain things and made peace with never getting them back. Was that what she'd done? Made peace? Or had she just been hiding, using grief as an excuse to avoid the hard work of staying connected? When she visited the cabin 3 days later, the men noticed immediately. Harlan, perceptive beneath his gruffness, asked if she was all right. She found herself showing them the letter, letting them read it. These 12 men who understood absence in ways few people could. Vernon read it twice, his hands gentle on the paper. When he handed it back, his eyes were wet. "You have to go," he said. "You have to write her back and tell her yes." "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," Vernon insisted. "She's giving you a chance most of us will never get. Don't throw it away because you're scared." "What if I disappoint her again?" Greer asked. "What if I'm not capable of being what she needs?" "Then you disappoint her," Polk said, his voice firm. "But you do it while trying, not while hiding. There's honor in failing after giving it your best. There's nothing but regret in not trying at all." The conversation stirred something in the cabin, an energy that felt both hopeful and desperate. Other men began talking about their own families, wondering aloud what they'd say if they had the chance, how they'd explain 3 decades of silence, Sullivan pulled out a photograph, so worn the edges had gone soft. It showed a woman and two small children, all three smiling at the camera. "My wife," he said. "And our boys. They'd be 42 and 39 now. Maybe married. Maybe I'm a grandfather." He traced the woman's face with his thumb. "I wonder if she remarried. I hope she did. She deserved better than a husband who vanished." Moss, who rarely spoke, surprised everyone by saying, "I wrote letters once. First 5 years. Never sent them. Kept them in a box, thinking maybe someday." He shook his head. "Burned them all in year 6. Seemed cruel to keep holding on." The weight of accumulated loss filled the cabin. 30 years of unmailed letters, unspoken apologies, relationships that existed only in memory. Greer looked around at these men, proud, stubborn, loyal to each other, but isolated from everyone else, and saw her own future if she didn't change course. 20 more years of solitude, Sophie's letters eventually stopping. Grandchildren she'd never meet growing up with stories about the grandmother who'd chosen loneliness over love. "I'll write her back," Greer said quietly. "I'll tell her yes." Vernon's smile was transformative, erasing years from his weathered face. "Good. That's good, Greer." But the conversation had opened something that couldn't be easily closed. Over the next week, the cabin's atmosphere shifted. Men who'd been content with their routines began questioning them. Conversations turned to what-ifs and maybe we-coulds. The silver rings they all wore, she'd learned they'd made them in the second year, symbols of their pact, were touched more frequently, worried like prayer beads, as if the men were testing the weight of their promise against the weight of their longing. It was Thatcher who finally voiced what others were thinking. "The company that threatened us," he said one evening. "It doesn't exist anymore, does it? Companies merge, get bought out, dissolve. After 30 years, what are the odds the same people are even still around?" "Doesn't matter," Harlan said quickly. "We made a pact. The still 12. We stay together, stay silent. But why?" Thatcher pressed. "Why are we still hiding if there's nothing to hide from anymore?" The question hung heavy. Greer watched Polk, saw him struggling with something, his jaw working. Finally he stood and went to a cabinet built into the wall. From it, he retrieved a metal box, locked and clearly old. He set it on the table. "This is why," he said. "This is what we've been protecting." Inside the box, Greer would later learn, was their original testimony, the unedited version, with details the official investigation had buried. Names of executives who'd known about the safety violations, internal memos showing willful negligence, evidence that 17 men had died not through accident, but through calculated corporate indifference. The men had kept it even in hiding, because they'd believed it might matter someday. "If we open this, if we let the truth out, we break the pact," Willis said. "We've kept faith with each other for 3 decades. That has to mean something." "It means we survived," Vernon said. "But is survival enough? My daughter is 42 years old. I don't know her favorite color. I don't know what makes her laugh. I don't know if she's happy." His voice cracked. "We saved our lives, but did we really live them?" The cabin divided along invisible lines. Older men like Harlan and Garrett, who'd accepted their exile as permanent, argued for maintaining their course. Younger men like Thatcher and Vernon, who still had years ahead of them, wondered if those years had to be spent in hiding. Polk, the oldest and their de facto leader, stayed silent, his hands resting on the metal box as if it contained something alive. Greer realized she'd become a catalyst for change she hadn't intended. Her presence, her questions, her own journey toward reconnection with Sophie, all of it had disrupted the careful equilibrium these men had maintained. They'd been still for so long that any movement felt seismic. "What if," Vernon said carefully, "we researched, not revealing ourselves, just finding out what's happened in 30 years, whether the people who threatened us are still around, whether the company even exists, whether we're hiding from ghosts?" "I could help with that," Greer offered. "I could look into it discreetly. Find out what the landscape looks like now." Harlan shook his head. "You're asking us to question everything we've built. This place, this life, it's been hard, but it's been ours. We've had each other. If we start picking at threads, the whole thing might unravel." Or, Vernon countered, "we might find out we've been free for years and just didn't know it." The debate continued late into the night, but no decision was reached. Greer left the cabin with a sense of having broken something fragile. On the hike back to her own place, she thought about the silver rings, the pact they represented. 12 men promising to stay together, stay silent, stay still. It had saved them once. But salvation that required permanent stasis wasn't really salvation. It was just a different kind of prison. That night by lamplight, she wrote to Sophie. It took 7 attempts before she found words that felt honest without being cruel. "I'd be honored to come to your wedding," she wrote finally. "I know I haven't been the mother you deserved. I know I can't make up for lost time. But if you're willing to let me try, I'd like to be part of your life again. I'm scared I'll disappoint you. I'm scared I don't know how to be close to anyone anymore. But you deserve a mother who's at least willing to try. Thank you for not giving up on me." She sealed the letter before she could reconsider, addressed it with hands that shook slightly, and set it aside to mail the next time she went to town. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, a door opening after years of being locked shut. At the cabin in the hollow, 12 men were facing their own locked doors, their own questions about what it meant to be free versus being safe, to be alive versus simply surviving. And Greer, who'd been hiding in her own way for 15 years, understood that none of them, not her, not the men, could stay still forever. Eventually you had to choose, remain frozen in the moment that broke you, or risk the pain of thawing out and learning to move again. The choice was coming, whether any of them were ready for it or not. Winter arrived early that year, the first snow falling in mid-November. Greer helped the men prepare, hauling in extra firewood, checking the cabin's insulation, ensuring their stores would last through the cold months. The work was familiar, almost comforting, physical labor that required no emotional excavation. But beneath the routine, tension simmered. Boone's heart episode happened on a grey afternoon when snow was falling in thick, silent curtains. He'd been splitting kindling, moving slower than usual, when he suddenly dropped the axe and pressed his hand to his chest. His face went pale, then grey. He sank to his knees in the snow. Polk and Vernon got him inside, laying him on his bunk while the others hovered, frightened and helpless. Greer checked his pulse, irregular, too fast, and his breathing, which came in shallow gasps. She'd had wilderness first aid training during her ranger years, but this was beyond field treatment. "He needs a hospital," she said firmly. "This could be a heart attack. We need to get him medical help now." "No," Boone rasped. "Made a promise." "The promise doesn't matter if you're dead," Greer shot back. "It's the only thing that matters." He gripped her wrist with surprising strength. 30 years. Not breaking now. The other men stood in a circle, their faces etched with conflict. They knew she was right. They also knew what leaving would mean. The end of their life here, questions they weren't ready to answer. A world they'd opted out of demanding explanations. "We can't just let him die," Thatcher said, his voice desperate. "We made a choice," Harlan replied, but he didn't sound convinced. "We all knew the risks." Greer wanted to scream at them, at their stubborn loyalty to a pact that had outlived its purpose. But she also understood it. She'd made her own choices that prioritized principle over practical good sense. Who was she to judge? Boone's episode passed after 20 agonizing minutes. His color returned, his breathing steadied. But the incident left everyone shaken. That night the men gathered around the table while Boone rested, and the conversation finally broke open into territory they'd been avoiding. "We need to talk about the truth," Polk said. "The real reason we're still here? We're here because of the pact," Harlan insisted. "No." Polk's voice was gentle but firm. "We're here because we're afraid. The pact gave us a noble reason to hide, but what we're really hiding from isn't the company anymore. It's everything we gave up. It's facing our families and explaining why we chose this instead of them." The words landed like physical blows. Several men looked away. Vernon stared at his hands. "After the mine disaster, after the harassment started, I was terrified," Polk continued. "Not just for myself, but for my wife, my kids. The threats were real. Marcus's death proved that. Coming here made sense then. But somewhere along the way, the fear changed. It wasn't about physical danger anymore. It was about shame. About not knowing how to go back after being gone so long. I failed them, Vernon said quietly. My daughter needed me and I left. How do you come back from that? What do you say? Sorry I missed your entire life, sweetheart, but I was protecting you. He shook his head. She won't understand. None of them will. Greer, sitting at the edge of the group, felt her own shame rise up. She'd done the same thing in a different way. Hidden from Sophie because facing her meant facing all the ways she'd failed as a mother. The mountains had given her permission to disappear, just like this cabin had given the men permission to stay gone. There's something else you need to know, she said. The men turned to look at her. I've been researching. The company that threatened you, Consolidated Mining and Energy. It was bought out by a larger corporation in 2003. That corporation filed for bankruptcy in 2011. The assets were liquidated. It doesn't exist anymore in any meaningful form. The silence was profound. You're saying there's nothing left to hide from, Thatcher said slowly. I'm saying the corporate entity that wanted you silent is gone. The executives from back then, I looked them up. 3 are dead. 2 are in their 80s, retired in Florida. The one who was implicated in the safety violations did 18 months in federal prison for securities fraud in 1998. He died in 2015. What about Marcus? Polk asked. His death, I found the accident report. The car's brake line had corroded. The mechanic's inspection from 2 months before noted it needed replacement. Marcus probably couldn't afford the repair. Greer paused, letting that sink in. I found 3 other miners from different companies who died in suspicious circumstances in the mid-90s. But I also found dozens who testified and lived normal lives. The pattern you saw, it might have been real for a time, or it might have been tragic coincidence amplified by fear. Harlan stood abruptly, his chair scraping loud in the quiet. So you're saying we gave up 30 years for nothing? That Marcus's death was just bad luck and bad breaks? I'm saying the world moved on, Greer replied. The threat you were hiding from ended years ago, maybe decades ago. But you didn't know that because you were here, isolated, making decisions based on information that was 30 years old. The metal box sat on the table, closed and locked. Polk stared at it. Our testimony. The evidence we kept. Does it still matter? I don't know, Greer admitted. The statute of limitations for most crimes has passed. The company's gone. The people responsible are dead or too old to prosecute. But the truth still exists. 17 families lost people they loved because of negligence. That truth might matter to them, even now. Or it might just cause more pain, Willis said. Ripping open old wounds for what? Justice that can't be served? Money that won't bring anyone back? Vernon spoke, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. I want to give my daughter her letters. The ones I wrote but never sent. I want to look her in the eye and tell her why I left and that I'm sorry. I want to know if she's happy, if she's okay, if she hates me, or if there's any part of her that might forgive me. He looked around the table at his brothers in exile. I've been still long enough. I need to move again, even if it hurts. The confession opened a floodgate. Other men began admitting their own desires to see their children meet grandchildren they'd never known existed, walk into town without fear, die somewhere other than this cabin in the woods. But each admission was followed by expressions of guilt, as if wanting anything beyond their shared life here was betrayal. The pact kept us alive, Polk said. But I think Vernon's right. We've been still too long. We survived, and that mattered. But we're not dead yet, and maybe there's still time to do more than just survive. What are you proposing? Harlan asked warily. A vote. We've always made major decisions together, so we decide together. Do we maintain the pact and stay here until we die, or do we release each other from it and let every man choose his own path? Even if it means some leave and some stay? Thatcher asked. Even then, we've been brothers for 30 years. That doesn't end just because we're not all in the same place. The debate that followed was wrenching. Harlan argued passionately that breaking the pact dishonored everything they'd sacrificed, all the years they'd endured. Garrett, the oldest at 82, said he'd made his peace with dying here, that this was his home now. But others, Vernon, Thatcher, Sullivan, spoke with growing conviction about wanting more than this hidden life, wanting to try even if they failed, to reconnect with the world. Greer watched and listened, her heart aching for all of them. They'd been so young when they'd made their choice, in their 40s and early 50s, with what they'd thought was a lifetime to wait out the danger. They hadn't anticipated aging here, becoming elderly men for whom every year lost was increasingly precious. As the night wore on, Polk called for a formal vote, all in favor of releasing each man from the pact, allowing individual choice about whether to stay or go. Say aye. 9 voices said aye, some firm, some hesitant. 3 said no: Harlan, Garrett, and Moss, the holdouts, the ones for whom the cabin had become not prison but sanctuary. The ayers have it, Polk said quietly. As of now, each man is free to choose. Those who want to stay, we honor that choice. Those who want to leave, we support that too. The Still 12 ends not in betrayal, but in respect for what each of us needs. Harlan stood, his face hard. I'm staying. This is my home. You all do what you want, but I'm not leaving. I'm staying too, Garrett said. I'm too old to start over. I'll die here, and I'm at peace with that. Moss simply nodded, indicating his agreement. The 9 who'd voted to explore leaving looked at each other, relief and terror mingling in their expressions. 30 years of certainty had just dissolved, leaving them free but unmoored, facing a future they'd never dared to imagine. Greer thought about her letter to Sophie, mailed 2 weeks ago. She'd had no response yet, and the waiting was excruciating. But she understood now, in a way she hadn't before, that the waiting was also the point. You had to reach out not knowing if you'd be received. You had to risk rejection for the possibility of reconnection. These men were facing that same risk, amplified by 3 decades of absence. Some of their families might embrace them. Others might turn them away. The uncertainty was terrifying. But staying still forever, frozen in the moment of their original fear, was a living death. I'll help, Greer said. However I can. Finding families, making contact, explaining. Whatever you need. Polk met her eyes and she saw gratitude there and fear, and something else, a fragile, tentative hope. Thank you, he said, for showing up, for asking questions, for reminding us that the world kept turning even while we stood still. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the hollow in white silence. Inside the cabin, 12 men sat with the weight of possibility, the pact that had bound them slowly loosening. The future, terrifying and open, waiting to be written. The discovery of Vernon's letters happened by accident. Greer had been helping him organize his few possessions in preparation for potentially leaving, and a canvas bag tucked beneath his bunk had fallen open. Hundreds of folded papers spilled out, each one covered in Vernon's careful handwriting. What are these? She asked, gathering them up. Vernon's face colored. Something I shouldn't have kept. But he didn't reach for them, didn't try to hide them. Instead, he sat heavily on his bunk, looking at the scattered papers with an expression of such profound sadness that Greer felt her throat tighten. Letters to my daughter, he said finally. I wrote her every week for the first 10 years, then monthly for the next 10, then whenever the weight got too heavy, which was less and less often as time passed. But I never sent any of them. What would be the point? She'd either think I was dead or that I'd abandoned her. The letters would just confuse things. Greer picked up one at random, unfolding it carefully. The date at the top read August 15th, 1997. Dear Lindsay, it began. Today I saw a doe with twin fawns and thought of you. You always loved watching the deer from our back porch, remember? You'd sit so still, barely breathing, afraid to scare them away. I wonder if you're still that patient girl, or if life has made you harder, more guarded. I hope not. I hope you've kept that gentle wonder you had. The letter went on for 3 pages, describing his days, his thoughts, his unchanging love for a daughter who'd been 12 when he left and would be 27 when he wrote those words. Greer read another, then another. Together, they formed a chronicle of a father's heart. Every milestone he'd missed, every moment he'd imagined, every hope and fear for a child he'd chosen to leave. Vernon, she said softly, These are beautiful. She needs to read them. They're outdated, he protested. She's 42 now. These letters are to a child, to a teenager, to a woman in her 20s. They don't match who she is anymore. They match who you were when you wrote them. They prove you never stopped being her father, even when you couldn't be present. Greer organized the letters by date, creating neat stacks. If you contact her, you should give her these. Let her see that you carried her with you all this time. Vernon took one of the letters, holding it like something fragile. What if she doesn't want them? What if seeing proof that I was thinking about her just makes her angrier? Like, you thought about me, but you still didn't come home. And she'll be angry, Greer said. But she'll also know the truth. That you didn't forget her. That you were never indifferent. Anger you can work with. Indifference you can't. Over the next few days, word of Vernon's letters spread through the cabin. It prompted other men to share their own attempts at connection, items they'd kept as talismans of their former lives. Sullivan showed his worn photograph. The colors faded to ghostly pastels. Willis had a child's drawing, carefully preserved in a plastic bag, that his son had made for Father's Day the year before he left. Thatcher had kept his wedding ring on a chain around his neck, never wearing it but never able to let it go. Each artifact was a small window into 3 decades of private grief. The men had survived together, supported each other, created a functional life. But they'd each carried private sorrows that the collective couldn't fully absorb. The still 12 had been their strength and their limitation, keeping them alive, but also keeping them separate from the very people they'd left behind to protect. Greer began the delicate work of locating families. She used the library's computer in Kenton, searching public records, social media, obituaries. Some trails were easy to follow. Children with uncommon names, families who'd stayed in the same town. Others proved more difficult. People had moved, remarried, died. 30 years was long enough for entire lives to unfold and conclude. She brought what she found back to the cabin each visit. Vernon's daughter Lindsay was alive, living 2 states away, working as a school counselor. She'd married at 28, divorced at 35, remarried at 39. She had 2 children from her first marriage, teenagers now. Greer found her social media profiles, showed Vernon photographs of a woman with his eyes and her mother's smile, standing with a family he'd never met. Vernon stared at the photos for a long time, his fingers hovering over the screen as if he might touch his daughter's face through the glass. "She looks happy," he said finally. "That's good. That's what I wanted." But his voice broke on the last word, and Greer understood that what he wanted and what he'd hoped for weren't the same thing. He'd wanted her to be happy. He'd hoped, secretly, that some small part of her had stayed sad, had missed him, had left a space for his return. The guilt of that hope was written on his face. Sullivan's sons had both done well. One was a doctor, the other an engineer. Both were married with children. Their mother, Sullivan's wife, had died 6 years ago. Cancer. Greer watched Sullivan absorb this news, saw him fold into himself. His wife had lived 15 years after he'd left, raised their sons alone, died without knowing whether her husband was alive or dead. "I did that to her," he said, his voice hollow. "I made her spend 15 years wondering, hoping, maybe waiting. And she died without answers." "You did what you thought you had to do," Polk said quietly. But even he looked shaken. Not all the news was sad. Thatcher's children had posted repeatedly over the years on missing persons forums, keeping their father's disappearance alive in public consciousness. They'd never stopped looking. That knowledge lit something in Thatcher's eyes, hope mixed with terror. "They want to find me," he said, wonder in his voice. "After all this time, they're still looking." The research also revealed what Greer had suspected. The men weren't fugitives, weren't wanted by law enforcement, weren't listed in any database as dangerous or criminal. They were simply missing persons, cases gone cold, families who'd filed reports 3 decades ago and received no answers. The world had moved on, but their families, at least some of them, had kept their memory alive. Greer's own answer came on a cold December morning. She found a letter from Sophie waiting at the post office, and she had to sit in her truck for 10 minutes before she could open it. When she finally did, tears came immediately. "Mom," Sophie had written, "thank you. Thank you for writing back. Thank you for being willing to try. I know this is scary for both of us. I know we don't know how to be mother and daughter after so long, but I'd like to try to figure it out. The wedding is in May, but maybe we could meet before then. Just for coffee or lunch, something simple. No pressure, just a beginning. I love you. I've never stopped loving you, even when I was angry, even when I didn't understand. Please come home." Greer sat in her truck outside the post office and cried, like she hadn't cried since James died. Sophie loved her. Sophie wanted her. There was still time to repair what she'd broken. When she shared the letter with the men, they celebrated quietly, their happiness for her, mixed with their own yearning. If Greer could find her way back to her daughter after 15 years, maybe they could find their way back after 30. But doubt plagued them. They were old now, in their 70s and 80s. What could they offer families who'd built lives without them? They'd miss so much. First steps, first days of school, graduations, weddings, births. They were strangers to the people they loved most. "You offer the truth," Greer said, echoing Polk's words from weeks earlier. "You offer honesty about why you left and that you're sorry. You offer whatever time you have left. That might not feel like enough, but it's what you have. And it's more than they've had for 30 years. Vernon made the first move. With Greer's help, he drafted a letter to Lindsay. It was simple, direct, almost painfully honest. "I'm your father. I didn't die. I left to protect you, and I stayed gone too long. I'm sorry. If you're willing to talk, I'd like to explain. If you're not, I understand. But I need you to know I never stopped loving you, and I never forgot you were my daughter." They sent the letter with no guarantee of response. Vernon spent the next week in a state of quiet agony, jumping at every sound, searching Greer's face each time she arrived for any hint of news. The response came 2 weeks later. A brief email to the address Greer had created for Vernon, forwarded to her to print out and bring to him. It said simply, "I'll meet you. But I need time to prepare, and I need you to understand that I don't know if I can forgive you. But I need to hear the truth." Vernon read the email 3 times, his hands shaking. Then he looked up at his brothers, at the men who'd been his only family for 30 years. "She'll see me," he said. "My daughter will see me." The cabin erupted in quiet celebration, but underneath ran a current of fear. This was real now. The possibility of leaving, of reconnecting, of facing the consequences of their long absence. It was no longer theoretical. It was happening, and once it started, once that first connection was made, there would be no going back to the stillness they'd maintained for 3 decades. The world was coming for them, invited or not, and they would have to meet it not as the still 12, but as individual men with individual stories, individual regrets, individual hopes for redemption. The pact that had saved them was dissolving. What came next, no one could say. The metal box had sat unopened on the table for weeks, a silent presence none of them had been ready to confront. But on a January morning, when snow piled high outside and the cabin felt smaller than usual, Polk finally unlocked it. The key he used was worn smooth from years of handling, kept on a leather cord around his neck, even though he'd never once opened the box in Greer's presence. Inside were documents, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Their original testimony from the mine disaster investigation. Internal company memos, safety inspection reports with falsified signatures, maintenance logs showing deferred repairs, and photographs of the mine before the collapse, of the men who died, of the survivors standing together at the funeral, young and haunted and angry. But there was something else. At the bottom of the box, beneath all the official documents, was a newspaper clipping Greer hadn't seen before. The paper was yellowed, fragile, dated October 1994, 6 months after the men had disappeared into the mountains. The headline read, "Miner who accepted settlement dies in accident." Greer picked it up carefully, reading the brief article. Marcus Brennan, 43, died Saturday when his vehicle left Route 47 and crashed into a ravine. Police report that Brennan, who had been drinking, lost control on a wet road. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Brennan was a survivor of the Cedar Hollow mine disaster in April and had recently accepted a settlement from Consolidated Mining and Energy. He is survived by his wife and daughter. We've all read that 100 times, Polk said quietly. It's why we stayed hidden, why we believed we'd be next if we ever tried to leave. But there was more. Tucked behind the clipping was a handwritten note, the ink faded but still legible. Greer recognized the handwriting from the ledger. It was Polk's. The note read, "Called Jenny, M's wife, from payphone. Nova 94. She said M had been scared. Receiving threats, his brakes failed day before accident. Mechanic said they'd been cut. She believes company killed him. Confirmed our worst fears. We stay hidden." The revelation hit Greer like cold water. You talked to his widow? After he died? Polk nodded. Once it was dangerous, but I had to know. She told me Marcus had been terrified in the weeks before he died. He'd wanted to back out of the agreement, said he'd made a mistake signing. Then the threat started, calls at night, his car vandalized. He'd taken it to a mechanic the day before because the brakes were acting strange. The mechanic found the brake line had been deliberately cut, or had corroded, Greer said carefully. I found the accident report. It mentioned brake failure, but the official cause was listed as corrosion and deferred maintenance. Nothing about it being cut deliberately. The official report was a whitewash, Harlan said sharply. You think they were going to admit to murdering a man? I think, Greer said slowly, that you've been operating on information that might not have been complete. She pulled out her own folder of research, information she'd been gathering for weeks. I found something you need to see. She spread out printouts on the table. News articles from the mid-90s about other mining disasters, other companies, other survivors. She'd found a pattern, but not the one the men expected. Between 1993 and 1997, there were 17 mining accidents across 5 states. In 12 of those cases, survivors testified about safety violations. Of those survivors, 5 died in the following 2 years. 2 in car accidents, 1 in a house fire, 1 from a fall, 1 from what was ruled a suicide. She paused, letting them absorb this. It looks like a pattern. It looks like systematic silencing. Exactly, Vernon said. You're proving our point. But, Greer continued, I kept researching. From 1997 to 2005, there were 23 more mining accidents. Survivors testified in 18 of those cases. And do you know how many of those survivors died in unusual circumstances in the following years? The men waited, tension thick in the air. 2, both from actual accidents, 1 drowning while fishing, 1 from a farming equipment malfunction. The pattern stops in 1997. The same year, federal prosecutors indicted 3 executives from Consolidated Mining for securities fraud and falsifying safety documents. They served time. The company was investigated, restructured, eventually absorbed by a larger corporation. She pulled out another document. This is Marcus's full accident report, obtained from the state police archives. The mechanic's statement is in here. He did note that the brake line was damaged, but his exact words were severe corrosion, consistent with salt exposure and age. Vehicle was 12 years old, driven in winter conditions. Brake line had not been replaced per manufacturer recommendations. There's no mention of deliberate cutting, Jenny said. Polk began. Jenny said what she believed based on fear and grief, Greer interrupted gently. Marcus had been getting threats. He was scared. When the brakes failed, she concluded they'd been sabotaged. But grief and fear make us see patterns that might not exist. The mechanic found standard corrosion. The police found an open bottle of whiskey in the car. Maybe Marcus started drinking because he was scared. Maybe he got drunk and drove anyway, and the combination of impaired judgment and failing brakes caused the accident. The silence in the cabin was profound. Greer watched understanding dawn on their faces, followed by something more painful, doubt. You're saying Marcus's death was just an accident? Vernon asked, his voice small. That we've been hiding from nothing? I'm saying Marcus's death was probably a tragic accident that you interpreted through the lens of legitimate fear. The threats were real. I found evidence of harassment campaigns against mine workers in that era. But the conspiracy you believed in, the systematic murder of anyone who spoke out, I can't find evidence that it lasted beyond the mid-90s. And even then, I can't prove it was coordinated corporate policy versus individual intimidation by local managers acting outside official channels. She pulled out one more document. This is an analysis of the 17 deaths I mentioned. A researcher at West Virginia University studied them in 2003. She concluded that the death rate among testifying miners was actually consistent with the death rate for that demographic generally. Working class, men in their 40s and 50s, manual laborers with health issues from years underground. The accidents looked suspicious in isolation, but statistically they weren't anomalous. Polk stared at the document spread across the table, his face gray. We gave up 30 years based on a misunderstanding? You gave up 30 years based on reasonable fear, Greer corrected. The threats were real. Marcus did die. The timing was suspicious. In your position, with the information you had, hiding made sense. You weren't being paranoid. You were being prudent. But we could have come back, Thatcher said, his voice rising. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, we could have left and been safe. You didn't know that, Greer said. You were isolated. You had no way to know when the threat ended, or even if it had ended. You made the best decision you could with the information available. Vernon stood abruptly, walked to the window, stared out at the snow-covered hollow. When he spoke, his voice was thick with unshed tears. My daughter got married. She had children. She built an entire life, and I wasn't there for any of it. And you're telling me I could have been? That I could have watched her grow up, been at her wedding, held my grandchildren if I'd just, what? Been braver? Waited longer. Come out of hiding 5 years sooner. You're telling me, Harlan said, his voice hard with anger, that Marcus's death was just bad luck? That the brake line just happened to fail right when he was being threatened? That's a hell of a coincidence. Coincidences happen, Greer said. And sometimes tragedy is just tragedy, not conspiracy. I know that's harder to accept than believing there was a powerful enemy. At least an enemy gives meaning to your sacrifice. The words landed like blows. The men had built their entire existence around the belief that they were protecting their families from a real, active threat. That their sacrifice mattered. That staying away was noble, necessary, the only choice that made sense. But if the threat had been smaller than they believed, if the danger had ended while they were still young enough to return, still capable of rebuilding relationships, then what did 30 years of self-imposed exile mean? It means we survived, Polk said finally, but his voice carried no conviction. It means we kept faith with each other. It means we were wrong, Vernon said bitterly. It means I abandoned my daughter for nothing, not for nothing, Greer insisted. For a reasonable interpretation of incomplete information. You couldn't have known. You made the best choice available at the time, but she could see they didn't believe her. The men looked at each other, at the cabin they'd built, at the life they'd created here, and saw it differently now. Not a refuge, but a prison they'd built themselves. Not a sacrifice, but a mistake, compounded year after year by fear and pride and the sunk cost of time already lost. Boone, who'd been silent through all of this, finally spoke. When does reasonable fear become cowardice? When does prudent caution become an excuse to hide? He looked around at his brothers. We were brave once. We stood up to the company, refused their money, insisted on telling the truth. Then one of us died, and we ran. We ran and we kept running, and somewhere along the way, we stopped running from danger and started running from the consequences of running. The observation was devastating in its accuracy. The men had become so invested in their identity as the Still 12, in the narrative of necessary sacrifice, that they'd lost sight of whether the sacrifice was still necessary. They'd built a life around their fear, and that life had become more comfortable than facing what they'd lost. What do we do now? Willis asked. How do we go forward knowing this? The same way you were already planning to, Greer said. You reach out to your families. You tell them the truth, all of it. including that you stayed hidden longer than you had to because you were afraid. You offer apologies, explanations, whatever time you have left, and you accept that some of them might not forgive you. Why should they? Harlan said. We wouldn't forgive us. Maybe not, Greer agreed. But you have to try anyway. The alternative is dying here, still hiding, having learned the truth but done nothing with it. Is that really better? The question hung in the air. Outside, wind rattled the cabin's walls. Inside, 12 men sat with the wreckage of their certainty, the comfortable narrative of their lives shattered by information they'd had no way to obtain while isolated. They'd been right to hide at first, but they'd stayed hidden too long. And that excess, those extra years, maybe decades, was theft they could never repay. Vernon turned from the window, his face wet with tears. I'm going to meet my daughter. I'm going to give her the letters and tell her everything. And if she can't forgive me, at least she'll know I never stopped being her father, even when I failed at showing it. One by one, the other men who'd voted to leave nodded agreement. They would go forward, carrying the weight of wasted years, of wrong conclusions, of fear that had calcified into permanent absence. They would face their families not as heroes who'd sacrificed for noble cause, but as men who'd made an understandable mistake and then failed to correct it. The truth was more complicated and more painful than simple villainy. But it was the truth. And after 30 years of hiding, the truth was the only thing they could offer. The weeks following the revelation were the hardest any of them had experienced since the early days of their exile. The cabin, once a place of certainty and shared purpose, became a space of fractured morale and individual reckoning. Men who'd lived in harmony for 30 years suddenly struggled to be in the same room, each one's pain amplifying the other's. Harlan took it the hardest. He'd been the most vocal advocate for maintaining the pact, for staying hidden, for honoring their commitment. Learning that the commitment had outlived its necessity broke something in him. He spent long hours outside, even in the bitter cold, chopping wood with a fury that bordered on violence. When Greer tried to talk to him, he turned away. I convinced them, he said finally, one afternoon when she found him sitting on a stump, axe in hand, staring at nothing. When some of the guys wanted to leave 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I talked them out of it. I said we couldn't break faith. I said we owed it to each other and to Marcus's memory to stay hidden. And I was wrong. I kept them here for nothing. You kept them safe, Greer said. You couldn't have known. Don't, Harlan interrupted harshly. Don't make excuses for me. Vernon could have watched his daughter grow up. Thatcher could have been at his kids' weddings. Sullivan could have been with his wife when she died. But they weren't, because I convinced them to stay. That's on me. The guilt was eating him alive, and Greer had no words that could fix it. Sometimes blame was real, even when intentions were good. Harlan would have to carry that weight, and it might break him, but others were channeling their pain into action. Vernon spent every spare moment organizing his letters, reading through them, adding new ones that contextualized the old. He was building a chronicle, a complete accounting of his 30 years away, to give to Lindsay. It was his way of trying to bridge the unbridgeable, to make visible the invisible thread that had connected him to his daughter, even in absence. Thatcher worked with Greer to draft messages to his children. His hands shook as he typed on her laptop, unused to keyboards, struggling with technology that hadn't existed when he'd left. But he persisted, writing and rewriting until he had something that felt honest. I don't know how to explain this, he said, showing Greer his 7th attempt. How do I tell them I stayed away because I was scared? That sounds weak, but any other explanation sounds like I'm making excuses. Scared isn't weak, Greer said. Scared is human, and staying hidden because you were protecting them, that's not weakness, it's love that was misguided by fear. Let them see that. Let them see you as a man who made a mistake, not a villain who didn't care. The photograph from 1994, the one showing all 12 men young and whole, taken the day before the disaster, became a focal point. They'd kept it all these years, but rarely looked at it, as if seeing their younger selves was too painful. Now they gathered around it, studying faces that belonged to men they barely recognized. "We were so sure," Sullivan said, pointing to his own face in the photo, young and defiant. "Look at us. We thought we knew everything. Thought we could change the world by refusing to be silent. We were brave," Polk said quietly. "Don't forget that. We stood up when it mattered. The mistake wasn't standing up. It was staying down too long. That distinction mattered. The men needed to hold on to something, some core of dignity that would sustain them through the approaching reunions. They'd been heroes once, at the moment of choosing truth over money. The error had come after, in the duration, in failing to reassess as time passed. Greer, watching them process this, felt her own reckoning approaching. She'd agreed to meet Sophie in late February, just 6 weeks away. The prospect terrified her. She'd spent so long building walls, cultivating isolation, that the thought of vulnerability felt almost physically painful. But she'd committed, and the men's courage was giving her courage. "I don't know how to be a mother anymore," she admitted one evening, sitting around the fire with Polk and Vernon. "I don't know if I ever really knew. I failed Sophie when she needed me most. How do I walk back into her life and offer anything worth having?" "You offer yourself," Polk said. "Flawed, scared, imperfect. You offer honesty about where you've been and why. And you offer the time you have left to try to do better. That's all any of us can offer." The practical preparations began. Greer helped the men acquire basic necessities for re-entering the world. Clothing that fit, identification documents, money from the small savings they'd accumulated. Getting ID was complicated, but not impossible. They'd been reported missing, not dead. With proper documentation and patient explanation to the right authorities, they could be re-established in the system. They also had to decide logistics. Where would they go? How would they support themselves? Most were old enough for Social Security, which they'd never collected. Some had pensions from mine work that had been held in trust. But the bureaucratic maze was daunting for men who hadn't dealt with paperwork in 3 decades. Greer enlisted help from a legal aid attorney she'd known during her ranger days. The woman Sharon was initially skeptical, then fascinated, then committed. She worked pro bono, cutting through red tape, filing necessary forms, advocating on their behalf. The law, it turned out, had provisions for people who'd been missing and wanted to reclaim their legal existence. It wasn't common, but it was possible. "You'll all be designated as voluntary missing persons who have returned," Sharon explained during a visit to the cabin. "There's no crime in disappearing if you're not evading legal obligations. You'll need to be interviewed by authorities, mostly to establish that you weren't coerced, that you're mentally competent. But after that, you're free to resume your lives. Free, the word hung heavy. They'd been physically free for 30 years in a sense. No chains, no guards, no locked doors. But psychologically, they'd been prisoners. Now they had the chance at actual freedom, and it was terrifying. The plan crystallized slowly. They would leave in late February, timed with Vernon's meeting with Lindsay. He'd asked the others to come with him for support, and they'd agreed. They'd rent a house together initially, maintaining their community while taking first steps back into the world. Then gradually, as individual reconciliations progressed or failed, they'd disperse or stay together as circumstances dictated. Garrett, Harlan, and Moss remained committed to staying in the cabin. It was their home, they insisted. They'd die here, and there was dignity in that choice. The others would know where to find them, could visit, but they wouldn't leave. "We're too old to start over," Garrett said simply. He was 82, his health declining, his peace made. "This place has been good to us. We'll honor it by staying." Boone was more conflicted. His heart episode had scared him, made him aware of mortality in ways he'd been avoiding. He wanted to see his family one more time, wanted to die among people who'd known him in his first life, not just his second. But he also feared the judgment, the anger, the disappointment. "What if they hate me?" he asked Greer. "What if my kids look at me and see a man who abandoned them?" "Then you'll know," Greer said. "And knowing is better than wondering. Wondering will eat you alive. Knowing, even if it's painful, gives you something to work with." As departure day approached, the cabin took on the quality of a wake. They were mourning the loss of their shared life, even while celebrating the possibility of what came next. Every routine became laden with significance. Every meal around the long table felt like a last supper. They were saying goodbye to the Still 12, to an identity that had sustained them through impossible years, and stepping into uncertain individual futures. One evening, a week before they were scheduled to leave, Polk called them all together. He held the photograph from 1994, the image of 12 young miners full of righteous anger and naive certainty. "We need to transform this," he said. "This cabin, this place, it can't just be a secret we leave behind." It meant something. We meant something. I propose we mark it officially. Make it a memorial, not to hide, but to honor what we experienced here. Boone, the craftsman, nodded slowly. I can make a sign. Something permanent, something that tells the truth. Over the next days, Boone worked on what would be his final project in the cabin. He selected a piece of aged oak, sanded it smooth, carved letters deep and clear. The sign read, "The Still 12, 1994-2024, we kept faith." It was simple, dignified, true. They would place it at the trailhead, marking the path to the cabin, but not revealing its exact location. Anyone who found it could follow if they chose, could discover the cabin and the life lived there. But the men would no longer be hiding. They'd be remembered. The night before departure, none of them slept much. They sat around the fire, talking quietly, remembering. They'd been so young when they'd arrived here, most in their 40s and 50s, full of fear but also strength. Now they were elderly, worn by time and isolation, but still bound by the shared experience. "We survived," Polk said, raising a cup of coffee and toast. "Against odds, against fear, against everything that should have broken us. We survived together. That counts for something. It counts for everything," Vernon agreed. "Whatever happens next, we had this. We had each other when no one else would understand." They drank to that, to brotherhood forged in exile, to loyalty that had cost them everything and given them something rare. As dawn approached, they extinguished the fire, packed the few possessions they'd take with them, and prepared to walk away from the only home many of them had known for their entire adult lives. Greer, who'd been with them through the final weeks, stood at the cabin door as they gathered. She thought about her own journey, from grief-stricken widow to isolated hermit to woman on the verge of reconnecting with her daughter. These men had given her that gift, even while struggling with their own reckonings. They'd shown her that it was never too late, that fear was surmountable, that the risk of rejection was worth the possibility of connection. "Thank you," she said to Polk, "for trusting me, for letting me be part of this." "Thank you for finding us," Polk replied, "for asking the questions we'd stopped asking ourselves, for reminding us that we were more than our fear." As they prepared to leave, Greer looked back at the cabin one final time. It had sheltered 12 men through 30 winters, kept them safe when the world felt dangerous, provided sanctuary when they'd believed they had nowhere else to go. Now it would stand empty, a monument to sacrifice and survival, to fear and loyalty, to the complicated truth that sometimes the prisons we build to protect ourselves become the very things we need to escape. The Still 12 were moving again, and whatever waited for them, forgiveness or rejection, reconciliation or final goodbyes, it would be real. After 30 years of stillness, they were finally, terrifyingly, alive again. The coffee shop where Vernon would meet his daughter was in a small town 2 hours from the Hollow, neutral territory where neither of them held memories. Greer had helped choose it, public enough to feel safe, quiet enough for difficult conversation. Vernon had insisted the other men come with him, not to the meeting itself, but to the town, to be nearby. He needed to know they were close, that if it all fell apart, he had somewhere to return to. They'd rented a small house on the outskirts of town, all of them cramped into 3 bedrooms, adapting to walls and electricity and the constant hum of civilization. The first night had been hard. Sounds they'd forgotten existed. Cars passing, neighbors' television sets, the general ambient noise of human proximity kept them awake. Thatcher had gone outside at 2 in the morning just to find silence, only to discover there was no real silence here, not like in the Hollow. But they'd persisted. This was the world they'd left, the world they needed to rejoin. Discomfort was part of the cost. The morning of Vernon's meeting, the house was tense with collective anxiety. Vernon had bathed, shaved carefully, dressed in new clothes that felt strange after decades of worn flannel and denim. He held the box of letters, hundreds of them, 30 years of words never sent, like it might explode. What if she doesn't show? He asked for the 10th time. Then you wait, Polk said firmly. You wait as long as it takes. And if she never comes, at least you tried. Greer drove him to the coffee shop, arriving 15 minutes early. Vernon sat in the car, staring at the entrance, paralyzed by fear and longing. Through the window, they could see people inside. Normal. People living normal lives, completely unaware that one of them was about to have his entire world reshaped. I don't know if I can do this, Vernon said. You can, Greer replied. You've survived 30 years in the wilderness. You can survive 30 minutes in a coffee shop. At exactly 3 o'clock, a woman walked up to the entrance. She paused outside, looking through the window, her hand on the door handle. Vernon made a sound, half gasp, half sob. That's her. That's Lindsay. She was 42, tall like Vernon, with his eyes and her mother's dark hair. She wore a practical coat, carried a purse clutched tight against her body like armor. She looked nervous. She also looked angry, the set of her jaw suggesting she'd come not because she wanted to, but because she needed to. Go, Greer said gently. Vernon got out of the car on shaking legs, the box of letters in his hands. He walked toward the coffee shop, and halfway there, Lindsay saw him through the window. She went very still, her face cycling through emotions too fast to track. Shock, recognition, anger, grief, all of it compressed into seconds. Vernon stopped at the door. For a long moment, father and daughter stared at each other through glass, separated by 30 years and 3 feet of space. Then Lindsay pulled open the door. You look old, she said. Not cruelly, just stating fact. I thought you'd still look like I remember. You look exactly like your mother, Vernon replied, his voice breaking. You're beautiful. They stood in the doorway, blocking traffic, neither quite able to take the next step. Finally, Lindsay gestured to a corner table. We should sit. Greer watched from the car as they settled across from each other, the box of letters between them like a bridge or a barrier, she couldn't tell which. Vernon was talking, his hands gesturing, explaining. Lindsay was listening, her face carefully neutral, arms crossed. This was going to be hard. This was going to hurt. But it was happening. After 20 minutes, Greer left. She'd given Vernon money for a cab back to the house, told him to take as long as he needed. This wasn't her moment. It was his and Lindsay's, and 30 years of absence trying to compress into understanding. She drove to a park on the edge of town, sat on a bench, and thought about her own meeting with Sophie, scheduled for next week. She'd been using Vernon's courage to fuel her own, but now that his moment had arrived, she felt her own fear rising. What if Sophie looked at her with the same guarded anger Lindsay had shown Vernon? What if 15 years proved as unbridgeable as 30? Her phone rang. It was Thatcher. Vernon called. He needs to be picked up. Greer's heart sank. Already? It's only been 40 minutes. He didn't say why. Just asked if someone could come get him. She drove back to the coffee shop, expecting to find Vernon devastated, his worst fears confirmed. Instead, she found him sitting on a bench outside, the box of letters open beside him, several scattered on his lap. His face was wet with tears, but he was smiling. She read 3 of them, he said as Greer approached. Right there at the table. She cried. Then she got angry. Then she cried again. She said she needed time, needed to process. But she took the box. She's going to read them all. Vernon, she has my phone number now. The one you set up for me. She said she'd call when she's ready to talk more. She didn't promise forgiveness. She didn't say we could have a relationship. But she's willing to keep trying. He looked up at Greer, wonder in his eyes. She called me Dad. When she left, she said, goodbye? Dad. I thought I'd never hear that word again. Greer sat beside him. And they stayed there for a long time. letting the magnitude of small mercies sink in. A daughter who'd kept the letters. A father who'd finally delivered them. No guarantee of happy endings, but the possibility of healing. After 30 years of absence, the first tentative thread of connection had been offered and accepted. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And sometimes, something was enough to build on. Thatcher's reunion happened 3 days later, orchestrated through a series of careful phone calls and emails that Greer had helped facilitate. His son Michael, now 47, had agreed to meet. He'd brought someone with him, not his sister, who'd refused to participate, but his own son. Thatcher's grandson, a young man of 19, who'd never known his grandfather existed until a week ago. They met at the rented house. Thatcher too nervous to go anywhere public, needing the support of his brothers nearby. When Michael's car pulled up, every man in the house went silent. This was the test. Vernon's meeting had gone as well as could be hoped, but every family was different, every wound unique. Michael got out first, a tall man with Thatcher's compact build and his mother's dark coloring. He moved slowly, warily, like someone approaching something that might bite. His son followed, curious but guarded, staying close to his father. Thatcher met them at the door. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Michael said, "You're alive." "I'm alive," Thatcher confirmed. "We looked for you. For years. Mom died believing you were dead. Or worse, that you'd abandoned us because you didn't love us. She died thinking she hadn't been enough to make you stay." The words were brutal, precise, designed to wound. Thatcher absorbed them, his face crumbling. "I loved your mother more than my own life. I left to protect her. I believed, we all believed, that staying would put you in danger." "From who?" Michael demanded. "From what? You vanished for 30 years because of threats that apparently stopped decades ago. That's not protection. That's cowardice." Thatcher didn't defend himself. He nodded slowly. "You're right. I stayed away too long. The threat that made me leave was real, but I should have reassessed, should have found a way to check if it was still real. Instead, I hid, and your mother paid the price." "You paid the price. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it, but I'm sorry anyway." The grandson spoke up unexpectedly. "Show him the tags." Michael hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of military dog tags. He held them out to Thatcher, who took them with shaking hands. "I served 8 years in the army," Michael said, his voice softer now. "Did 2 tours overseas. These are from my first deployment. I asked them to add something." He pointed to the second line of the tags, where a name was engraved. "Father, Thatcher Brennan, who stayed 94, killed in action," Thatcher whispered. "You thought I died in the mine. That's what Mom told us when we were kids. It was easier than explaining you'd just disappeared. When I joined the military, I wanted to carry you with me, the father I'd lost. Turns out you weren't dead. You were just gone." The pain in Michael's voice was raw and fresh, 30 years compressed into present tense. But there was something else too. Underneath the anger, a desperate longing. He'd kept his father's name engraved on his tags. He'd carried him into war. He'd mourned him. And some part of him, Thatcher realized, wanted the father back even while hating him for leaving. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Thatcher said. "But I want you to know what I thought about every single day. You and your sister. I wondered who you'd become, whether you were happy, whether you remembered me. I knew I'd failed you by leaving, but I believed I'd fail you worse by staying and putting you in danger. We needed you," Michael said simply. "Danger or not, we needed our father. You chose fear over faith. You decided you knew better than we did what we needed." "You're right," Thatcher said again. "There was no defense, no justification that would make this better. I was wrong. I stayed away too long, and I'm sorry." The grandson, who'd been watching this exchange with wide eyes, spoke again. "I'm Brandon. Your grandson. I'm named after your father. I found that out last week when Dad told me about you." Thatcher looked at this young man, this unexpected gift, and felt something break open in his chest. "My father was a good man," he managed. "I hope you're like him." "Dad says I'm like you," Brandon replied. "Stubborn." That's what he always said. "You're stubborn like your grandfather, the one we lost. Except we didn't lose you. You lost us." The observation was devastating in its simplicity. Thatcher had spent 30 years thinking of himself as lost to the world, to his family, to normal life. But his family had been lost too, lost to him through his own choice. He'd taken himself away and called it sacrifice. "Can I show you something?" Michael asked abruptly. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through photos, turned the screen to Thatcher. "That's your granddaughter. My daughter, Emma. She's 16. She wants to meet you, but she's scared. Says she doesn't know how to have a grandfather." Thatcher stared at the photo, a teenage girl with his mother's smile, a girl he'd never known existed until this moment. "I don't know how to be a grandfather," he admitted, "but I'd like to learn, if she's willing." "If you're willing," Michael and Brandon exchanged glances. Some silent communication passed between them. Then Michael said, "We're not promising anything. We're not saying it'll be easy or that we'll ever fully forgive you, but we're willing to try. Mom would have wanted that. She never stopped loving you even when she was angry. Maybe we can honor her by at least trying." It wasn't absolution. It wasn't restoration of what had been lost. But it was a door cracked open, light spilling through. Thatcher could either step toward it or turn away. After 30 years of turning away, he chose to step forward. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for giving me a chance I don't deserve." They stayed for 2 hours, talking carefully, sharing photos and stories, building the beginning of something that might someday resemble a relationship. When they left, Thatcher stood in the doorway watching their car disappear, his hand clutching the dog tags his son had let him hold. The weight of his father's name, a reminder of continuity and loss. The other men gathered around him silently. They understood. Some reconciliations would be easier than others. Some families would reject, others would cautiously accept. But every attempt mattered. Every moment of vulnerability, every honest apology, every small bridge built across years of absence, it all mattered. They were finding their way back, one painful step at a time. And whether they succeeded or failed, at least they were finally trying. 3 months had passed since the men left the hollow. Spring arrived, painting the mountains in green renewal, and Greer stood at the trailhead where Boone's sign now hung. Weathered already but still clear, the still 12, 1994-2024, we kept faith. She'd come to bring news to Garrett, Harlan and Moss, the 3 who'd chosen to stay. They were surviving, managing, but age was taking its toll. Garrett's health had declined further. He moved slowly now, spoke less, spent long hours sitting on the porch watching the seasons change. He'd made his peace, he said. This hollow was his final resting place, and he was content with that. Harlan had softened somewhat, his anger at himself transmuting into quiet acceptance. He tended the cabin, maintained the systems, took care of Garrett with gentle patience. "We built something here," he'd told Greer on her last visit. "It cost too much, maybe, but it was real. I can honor that by staying." Moss, as always, said little, but he seemed at peace, moving through his routines with the same steady reliability he'd shown for 3 decades. For him, the hollow wasn't a prison or a mistake. It was simply home. Greer brought them supplies and news. Vernon's daughter had agreed to meet again, and then again. The conversations were difficult, filled with anger and grief, but they were happening. She'd invited Vernon to meet his grandchildren. Small steps, fragile progress, but progress nonetheless. Thatcher had moved near his son's family. He saw them weekly, awkward visits that were gradually becoming less painful. His grandson, Brandon, had taken particular interest in his grandfather's story, treating him like a living history project. Emma, the granddaughter, was slower to warm up, but she'd agreed to have coffee with him once. It was something. Not all stories were as hopeful. Sullivan's sons had met with him once, listened to his explanation, then asked him not to contact them again. They had lives, families, commitments. Their father had been dead to them for 30 years, and resurrecting him now felt like disruption rather than reunion. Sullivan had taken it hard, but he'd accepted it. "At least I know," he'd said. "At least I tried." Boone had passed away in his sleep 2 weeks after meeting with his children. Heart failure, sudden and peaceful. But he'd died holding his granddaughter's hand in a hospital room surrounded by family who'd forgiven him. His funeral had been attended by all the men who'd left the Hollow, plus several who'd travelled from far away to pay respects to a man who'd spent 30 years in exile for principles he'd believed in. It wasn't a sad funeral. It was a celebration of a man who'd found his way home before the end. Greer shared all of this with the 3 men in the cabin, and they listened with the hunger of people starving for connection to the outside world. They'd chosen to stay, but they still cared deeply about their brothers' journeys. "And you?" Garrett asked. "Your daughter?" Greer smiled, and it was genuine, warm. The smile of someone who'd found something precious she'd thought lost forever. "Sophie and I are rebuilding. It's slow and it's not easy. We have coffee every other week. We talk on the phone sometimes. She's teaching me how to text." She laughed softly. "I was at her wedding last month. I didn't walk her down the aisle. We're not there yet. But I was there. I watched her marry a good man, and she introduced me to her friends as her mother. That felt like—" her voice caught. "That felt like grace I didn't deserve." "You deserved it," Harlan said firmly. "You made the choice to try. That's all any of us can do." Greer stayed for several hours, helping with chores, sharing a meal, sitting on the porch as afternoon stretched toward evening. Before she left, she walked down to the creek, to the spot where the men had buried their silver rings in a small wooden box. They'd marked it with a cairn of stones, a private memorial to the pact that had saved them and constrained them in equal measure. She added a stone of her own, a smooth river rock she'd carried from near her cabin. It was her way of honoring what these men had done, the sacrifice they'd made, even while acknowledging its cost. They'd kept faith with each other, absolutely and without reservation. That loyalty had been both their salvation and their prison. As she hiked back up out of the Hollow, the sun setting behind the mountains, Greer thought about her father's compass, still in her pocket. Don't get lost, Greerly. But sometimes being found was the greater challenge. Sometimes you had to let yourself be discovered, had to risk exposure and vulnerability, had to trust that the people you'd left behind might still want you despite everything. The Still 12 weren't 12 anymore. They were scattered now. 3 in the Hollow, 9 in various stages of reconnection with the world they'd left. But they remained connected, calling each other weekly, planning reunions, maintaining the bonds forged in exile, even as they built new lives beyond it. The cabin would stand for years, maybe decades, a monument to fear and loyalty, to sacrifice and survival. Hikers would occasionally find it, wonder about the sign, perhaps search for the story behind it. And maybe, someday, one of the men would write it all down, the truth, complete and unvarnished. 17 men had died in a mine because of corporate negligence. 12 men had survived and refused to stay silent. 1 had taken the settlement and died. 12 had hidden and survived. And eventually, after far too long, 9 had found the courage to stop hiding. It was a story about what fear could do to good men, about how loyalty could become its own kind of trap, about the difference between necessary sacrifice and unnecessary exile, about the complexity of trying to do the right thing when the right thing wasn't clear, but mostly it was a story about second chances, late, difficult, incomplete, but real. About the truth that it's never too late to try, even when trying means admitting you were wrong, even when trying means risking rejection, even when trying costs everything you've carefully constructed to protect yourself. Greer reached her truck as darkness settled over the mountains. She'd come back to check on the 3 men in another few weeks. She'd continue helping the others navigate their reunions and reconciliations. And she'd keep building her own relationship with Sophie, 1 coffee date, 1 phone call, 1 small moment of connection at a time. The mountains would remain, patient and ancient, witnesses to all the ways humans tried to survive, to hide, to emerge, to heal. And somewhere in those mountains, a cabin stood empty, save for 3 elderly men who'd chosen it as their final home. They'd been the Still 12 once. Now they were just men, living out their days in a place that had sheltered them when they'd believed they had nowhere else to go. It hadn't been a perfect solution, but it had been their solution, made with the best information they had, sustained by absolute loyalty. and finally released when they'd learned the truth that fear had kept them from seeing, that the world, for all its dangers, still had room for them, that their families, for all the pain they'd caused, still held space for reconciliation, that it was never too late to choose connection over isolation, vulnerability over safety, truth over comfortable fiction. Some secrets needed to be buried, but some needed to be spoken, even 30 years too late. The wisdom was knowing which was which, and the courage was living with whatever came after. Greer started her truck and headed home toward Sophie, toward a future she'd nearly sacrificed to grief and fear. Behind her, the mountains kept their silence, holding within them a story of 12 men who'd learned, painfully and slowly, that sometimes the hardest journey isn't into isolation, it's finding your way back from it.